Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Magical Egypt Summit. And I am so excited to have with me one of my absolutely most favorite people in the whole world, Peter Mark Adams. He has opened my eyes to so many incredible ideas. He is an absolute inspiration in terms of the books that he's written. And today we're so blessed to have him come and talk to us about a major building block in the story of magical Egypt. So welcome, Peter.
Hi there, Vanish. Lovely to see you. It's been a while, so looking forward to talking to you today.
It has been, darling, and I have to say I'm really excited for this talk. I was telling a friend lately that it wasn't until I spoke to you that I realized Magical Egypt was missing something rather crucial in its exposition of ancient Egypt, and that is the idea of magic. And the work that you have done and the help that you've given me in the upcoming series really changed my trajectory for the whole show. So I can't wait to see what you're bringing to us today, because hopefully it doesn't throw me off my I'm sure it'll just take me further down, but I really can't wait to see what you have for us.
Okay. I mean, just to frame this, from the earliest records that we have, which is like Herodotus, this, what, 6th century, 5th century, something like that, the impression of Egypt in this like Mediterranean world was that they were the masters of magic. And that reputation stayed with them for centuries. And you can see it like carried forward throughout the Hellenistic period. Like Egypt was the place you would go if you wanted to learn about magic. And it's carried forward throughout the Roman period and right through the Renaissance. And you see it still in the 18th century in the Masonic symbolism. You know, this constant echo of a distant land from which something very special and intangible could be found there and in its traditions. So I wanted to address this a little, but not from a historical perspective or a literary perspective for that matter, but to look at what it actually meant and what it was based on. And in order to explain this, I've coined the expression, the blueprint, to capture a dimension of reality that is the facilitator of all practical magic and mystery initiation. And the blueprint is a ritually generated symbolic structure within the larger field of consciousness. Okay. So it's actually generated from the energies of the participants in a ritual. And it's structured by the symbolism, which is key to their particular tradition of working. Okay. And within the field of consciousness, it exists independently of the ritualists. Okay. And it serves two purposes. One is that it can be used to cause non-local change in the larger world. Underline non-local because magic is essentially or defined as non-local change in the world. And it provides what I can only describe as a staging area for contact. Okay. So that contact will be symbolically mediated. It will occur in terms of the symbolism of this blueprint that's being created. But in itself, contact generally remains ineffable. Okay, it's the influx of a conscious presence, which is other dimensional and which we cannot perceive directly because it falls outside of the categories with which we structure reality. So when the blueprint is also called an egregore in the magical tradition, and And within the egregore, it will tend to shape external energies, positive and negative ones, in terms of its own symbolism. And so it seems to be like a self-fulfilling prophecy that deities or whatever show up in the form in which the ritual space has been shaped. But it doesn't mean they actually exist in that form. Okay. The egregore is acting as a kind of lens, so it filters out a lot of frequencies, and the ones it allows through are structured symbolically by the ritual group's own cultural formation. Okay, so this is by way of, this isn't too mind-blowing. To deal with this, you first need to put some groundwork in place. Okay, for many people, it's too big a leap to come from the reality in which we're situated day to day, and to go to this one. Okay, it's be quite a step. So we need to put some groundwork in place, make some pathway towards understanding this egregore, this blueprint. And the key idea is that on a day-to-day basis, we all naturally generate and become enmeshed in transpersonal fields of feeling and communication. And Rupert Sheldrake has described these fields as morphic fields. And the fact that they are efficacious in their own right as morphic resonance. So they're not passive fields. You generate it, you become enmeshed in it. So, and it then kind of feeds back to you and influences the course of your life and the things you experience, good and bad. So in my own case, I had to develop these ideas to cope with the phenomena that I had experienced in like 50 years of energy work, and certainly in the last 25 years of energy healing work. You know, there's so many phenomena that have arisen, you know, including entities, including deceased persons, and including attachments of various kind that have affected people's health and well-being. And that includes influences from past lives, from ancestry, from the familial background, that it needs a far more dynamic view of consciousness and our interaction with reality to be able to explain and work with these things. Because it wasn't a question of having a good theory. It's a question of whether you can turn your understanding into efficacious healing. Okay, and the result, so to speak, the proof is in the outcome. It's not a question of, oh yeah, I confirm my theory now. No, is that person feeling much better? Have their mental, emotional, and physical problems, if not resolved, are they mitigated so that they can go about life more comfortably? Okay, so that's kind of the background. That's where all this came from. So for me, therefore, it's not a theoretical exercise. The stuff I'm discussing today is the understanding necessary to deal with aspects of reality which are there and omnipresent, although we don't often, or are not often able to give an account of. Okay, they kind of exist on the periphery of sense and nonsense for most of us. Okay, but we don't need to think about this theoretically, because there's therapeutic modes that allow you to experience it for yourself. And any one of us can go off and do that. And principally, I would point to family constellation therapy as a easily accessible venue. Any of us can attend and see this for ourselves. You can just go and prove it. You don't have to take my word for it. By the way, all of this stuff is in my book, The Power of the Healing Field. I just want to mention that because the cases, I can't go through all the hundreds of cases that are in that book, but they're all documented there from our own case files. So the speculative element is minimal in this. Okay, so family constellation therapy was developed by Bert Hellinger, a psychiatrist, and it was based on his experience with Zulu people in South Africa. So what he understood is that their concept of healing was far more holistic and communal than anything Western psychology had to offer. And what we encounter with family constellation therapy, if you ever go along there, you'll turn up, there'll be a group of people, almost all of them you will never have seen before. And amongst the group, there'll be 2 or 3 maybe who want to actually have the therapy themselves. Everyone else is just a participant, essentially. And what happens is the person who wants the therapy doesn't actually need to declare what it's for. Okay, it's not a talk therapy. All they need to do is choose from the group people who represent key aspects of their particular familial problem. So they'll select somebody to represent their father, mother, grandparents, brother, sister, whatever, and they'll place them in the middle of the room in a kind of intuitive way that represents for them the dynamics of their own family situation. And then something very, very strange happens. That person sits down. They don't have to be involved in what is about to play out at all. Okay, spontaneously, each member of the group will begin to feel an emotional overlay. And what I mean by that is you remain fully aware of your own thoughts, feelings, sensations, but you suddenly have access to the thoughts, feelings, and sensations of someone else who you don't know who it is. And so the therapist just needs to go around and ask people, literally, what are you feeling? And based on their reporting of this overlay, you can then begin to understand the underlying dynamics of the family situation. Okay, this is where this is like the causative nexus of this person's emotional issues with their family. Okay, and just recall, up to now, they've said nothing about this. All they've done is nominate complete strangers and place them in the middle of the room to roughly represent the dynamics as they see it. And that is sufficient to generate or allow those people to tap into a field of consciousness that holds the memory of that family. Okay, and if people are missing from that because they've passed on, then you can bring in people to represent previous generations. And if the problem is deep in the past, you'll have grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents. You can trace the lineage, the ancestral lineage of a major problem in the ancestral line. And the extraordinary thing is, once you, so to speak, the field is activated now, that dynamic failure, that feeling in its rawest form. So the psychologist can then go about reconciliation. And once they found the core of the problem, normally through forgiveness and acceptance of forgiveness, through genuine heartfelt apology for harm given, is sufficient to recode the transpersonal field of consciousness. Okay, and that is inherently evolutionary, because you've now harmonized the flow of energy. Sure, it's in this family or ancestral line, but that's connected to every other. So these small baby steps, so to speak, are a way of evolving the entire species, and certainly evolving future generations. because they're not carrying forward the traumas of the past into the future. Okay, so this is like stuff anyone can go and experience. So I don't have to argue for its correctness. You can do it yourself. And it also works for systemic constellations, that's to say an organization that's dysfunctional in some way. Equally has this strange bubble of consciousness, which is kind of independent from the members of it, but they're all enmeshed within it and generating it and being influenced by it, okay? But it stands outside of them. And this is the incredible thing about this. So the field of consciousness is quite literally a shared one, which is why I use the word transpersonal. So do you want to say anything, Bernice? That was quite a big chunk of
It was amazing. And look, I'm going to validate that. I was involved in a process called the breakthrough experience with a teacher by the name of Dr. DeMartini. And he essentially takes you on a 2-day journey. But at the end of the journey, I was speaking with my deceased father. And it was the same phenomena. There was somebody in the room that was my dad. And, you know, and basically John walks up and says, do you have anything to say to Venice? And we had this really intense conversation as if he was actually in the room. And so what you're talking about, this phenomena, I've actually experienced myself. And it is spine jingling. So yeah, I absolutely understand exactly what you're talking about.
So it's interesting that this kind of stuff is known to other cultures. Like it was known in the African subcontinent, the communal dimension around the healing experience. And in fact, you even find it in Plato's Phaedrus. You know, there's a famous quote from that text where he talks about, you know, when diseases and the worst kinds of trouble plague certain families through some ancestral guilt, by taking refuge in prayers, service to the gods, purification and sacred rites, that's initiatory rites. Whoever is afflicted in this way is released from torment. So that was, you know, 4th century BCE. In, you know, and he mentions it like it was just like in passing. So it's interesting how much we have lost in terms of our understanding and ability to work with these things, since they're part of almost every culture in the world and almost wholly excluded from what we could call modernity's approach to psychology and health. You know, there's no doctor or psychiatrist who really considers the fact that you may be subject to ancestral forces, you know, or that ancestral forces are a thing in themselves. It's not a question of, you know, talk therapy. There's a moral problem deep in the ancestral line that needs to be resolved. It's blocked energy, essentially. So I just want to underline that, you know, Rupert Sheldrake has done a lot of work to clarify the operation of these fields, and they seem to envelop every species. You know, the way large flocks of birds can turn and wheel simultaneously, you know, it looks like a field rather than a series of individual decisions to keep up. You know, it's, you know, and he talks as well about the pets who know when their owners are about to return home. So, you know, again, you have this curious thing whereby you become enmeshed in a field which includes the people and animals closest to you. So all of a sudden, you know, you've got these kind of entanglements that most people are scarcely aware of. And yet those entanglements, those fields generate effects on our day-to-day health and well-being. So that's why they're so critical.
If I may jump in, one of the things that is really interesting with these fields is that when you're in a couple and one of your couple cheats, you know, somehow mysteriously inside of yourself, without necessarily any clues or anything, there's an energetic change within the dynamics of the relationship that is a result of that energy that you're used to meshing with new energy that you're not used to, right? So if you've ever been with a cheater, or if you're a cheater, you'll know what we're talking about, that there is definitely this energetic thing. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but I've noticed that as well.
Okay, that's an interesting one. Beware. Or at least be open about it if you take the consequences. Okay, so moving now from that background, okay, that's the foundation stone of the blueprint. We're now moving from fields that are, so to speak, unconsciously generated to fields where people have consciously generated them, purposely. And this is the magical tradition in its essence. So the fact that like groups in places like Africa have understood the mechanism of the field sufficiently to devise healing therapies, it's equally likely that they have understood the mechanism of the field to create change, non-local change in their environment, okay, which is now moving to another plane, another dimension of this. So the creation of what in the magical tradition is called an egregore marks the inception of a magical group. It is the first activity necessary for a magical group that is going to form for some particular purpose. And it requires ritual, not theatrical ritual, by the way. I want to make a distinction here between theatrical ritual and efficacious ritual. They're two different things. Theatrical ritual is just acting out. Efficacious ritual requires individuals within the ritual context capable of generating energies from their own being. Okay, highly energized individuals, so that they also generally have the capacity to switch off the rational dimension temporarily to engage emotionally with a symbolic structure. And because of that shift, the whole energy changes. Okay, they're working energetically rather than rationally, which doesn't mean that they're irrational. It just means that they have an added dimension of activity that they can engage in. You need some people like this within the ritual context to make it work. And normally these people are self-selecting. They're the types of people who go on to become shaman and to be very good with divination. They operate better on far subtler levels of reality than most of us. Most people are very much tuned into the material, and to the rational planning and so on, and all of those kinds of activities can be enormous. And when you study things like philosophy, of course, you're enhancing the rational analytic side of yourself. But actually, it's 180 degrees the opposite direction that we're now talking about, which doesn't mean it's irrational. It's irrational. It's a choice of an irrational and emotional response to a set of symbols rather than an analytic response to those symbols. Okay, so we're talking about the performative, and that is absolutely the key differentiator in all ritual contexts: performativity on an emotional level. So I really became aware of this with a wonderful small book is written by Alan Richardson, and it's called Dances to the Gods, The Magical Records of Charles Seymour and Christine Hartley, 1937 to 39. And it's a wonderful work because this is an offshoot of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was a turn of the century magical order in the UK. You know, it involved a number of amazing writers and poets like W.B. Yeats and artists and so on. But the fraternity or society of the inner light was an offshoot of it. It's associated with Dion Fortune. And Charles Seymour was one of her senior adepts. So these diaries that Alan Richardson has kind of recovered give a very detailed account of how they would go about ritual workings within that tradition. And that really filled in for me a missing part, because whilst I'm aware of, for instance, shamanic ritual or the ethnography of powerful ritual processes in Africa, to see similar or parallel paths being pioneered in polite society in London and the counties was amazing for me, you know, and you know, it's that book is like an ethnography of the ritual practices in the Western esoteric tradition. So it's very interesting. And again, we don't need to stay on some kind of literary or historical or whatever path about this. Let me give you an example from my own experience. At one point, I don't know, it's quite a few years ago now, I was doing very intensive meditations, energized meditation. And myself and my partner, meditating independently, but at the same time, had the same vision. This is very strange. And the vision was peculiar because it was of a Masonic temple. And when I say vision, I mean, I was there sitting, meditating physically. And then all of a sudden, this diorama opened up, and I was standing in a Masonic temple with this black and white square floor and columns. And I looked to my right, and on the floor, there was a coffin. Okay, and I was lying in it. This is the extraordinary thing. I suddenly realized that I'd stumbled into the egregore of the 3rd degree Master Mason initiation ritual. And let me just kind of prove that if I could just share this image. This is the tracing board, it's called. And it kind of summarizes all of the necessary dimensions of the Masonic 3rd degree Master Mason initiation. And you see, the coffin is the central image over there, and then it has the floor and the columns and everything else, the symbols. So this exists as an egregore. So when I'm not a Mason. I haven't been a Mason, at least in this lifetime. I must have been in some lifetime. But my partner and I both stumbled into the same space. And for me, it had an additional dimension to it, because after seeing the coffin on one side, I turned to the left, and there was like a railway track, a kind of symbolic path, which I followed. And I went into a kind of tunnel which suddenly went vertical. And I went straight up, and I emerged into this intense light. And within that light, I was aware of presences. And those presences were holy love. Okay, that's the only way to explain it. It was like a return to somewhere. It was like being welcomed back. even just for a short period, to be totally embraced. And then I kind of dropped out of the vision. So in a subsequent meditation, my partner had this vision. Again, the same space, same Masonic lodge space. And there was a podium and what looked like a red carpet, but it was a tongue, a large red tongue unrolled towards her. And there was a booming voice which says, "A well-hung tongue." And she said this to me, and I thought, do you know what this is? I mean, because my partner is not from Western culture, has no interest in Masonry, just this is totally out of the way for her. And she says, do you know what a well-hung tongue means? In all my experience, I've never come across that expression. Well, it was months later, I was reading a book by the novelist Andrew Sinclair, and he's one of the Sinclairs of Roslin, which of course is imputed to be the great center of the Templar Masonry crossover in Scotland. And he's written this book called The Sword and the Grail, which is non-fiction actually, but it traces his ancestry and connections with this Templar Masonic tradition. I was fascinated by this book. And then I came to a fragment of an 18th century Scottish Masonic lodge. You know, they have this question and answer format. Okay. And I was reading through this, you know, what's this, what's that? I came to a question, what is the key of your lodge? And the answer is a well-hung tongue. Couldn't believe it. So it's extraordinary that this encounter with the ritual egregore of Masonry, I believe it was probably set up in a past life. It definitely had a verification mechanism. This expression from an 18th century Masonic lodge text is extraordinary. I mean, the phrasing, a well-hung tongue, is not one that would ever occur to you, you know. And finally, the egregore led somewhere. It led into a higher dimension of consciousness. So in fact, although all of this happened in the space of just one or two meditations, it had all of the dimensions that we're talking about: a ritually generated space, symbolically structured, which affords access to another dimension, which remains ineffable because it's like it's just, you can't grasp it. You can only access it and understand it in relationship to the purpose of the Master Mason initiation. Okay, the perfection of the individual, and it has obviously been there for a long time. You know, so I'm assuming that probably, given the consistency of Masonry over the centuries, the continued enactment of these rites strengthens the egregore. So yeah, it continues forever and becomes an accessible space if you're warranted to access it. Okay, so so just want to, I think that's it. That for me is in essence the core of the blueprint, and I would suggest that the ability to perform efficacious rituals probably means that magical groups throughout history have created an egregoric form based on their own cultural symbolism that afforded access to higher dimensions, to contact, from which you could then gain a number of like educational or evolutionary impulses, but also provided a kind of an area from which you could exert power. Okay, so, once you're able to generate an egregore, presumably you could generate one on a more local basis to affect change at a distance from yourself. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about this issue of ritual efficacy, if I could. Let me give you examples again. I mean, that's the best way to go with this stuff. I mean, not to talk theoretically, but, what has actually happened. So I've got a quote now from two anthropologists, and their accounts are part of the scientific record. Okay, these are ethnographic studies. They're accepted as studies. They're part, therefore, of the scientific record, but nobody ever refers to them. Okay, it's like, okay. So Edith Turner, working, I think, in West Africa, talks about her attending a healing ritual. Again, as an ethnographer, she was interested in the process, of course. But she says, as the ritual progressed, she distinctly felt a gathering intensity, as she describes it, within the ritual space. These are her words. I felt the spiritual motion, a tangible feeling of breakthrough going through the whole group. Watching the healer's hands scrabbling at the woman's back, she reports, I saw with my own eyes a giant thing emerging out of the flesh of her back. This thing was a large gray blob, about 6 inches across, a deep gray opaque thing emerging as a sphere. And she described this as a revenant of a deceased person that had become attached to the woman's energy body. A miserable object, more akin to a restless ghost. And a summary here in the ethnographic record is that there is spirit stuff. There is spirit affliction. It is not a matter of metaphor and symbol or even of psychology. So again, I can confirm this. We have also had accounts parallel to this. And, if anyone's interested, they're all documented in the Power of the Healing Field. But there's a range of phenomena in the context of the interaction of deceased persons in the healing process. I think I've given 3 or 4 cases of that. Some of them are very positive, by the way. Generally, people who appear to have died unexpectedly in context where, like, for instance, hospitals where people may have been anesthetized, and in the throes of death, their energy body has become attached to somebody who was not in a position to defend themselves. So they leave the hospital, but the surgery never seems to heal properly. They retain persistent aches and pains, which, the doctor's saying, well, we don't know, So this is actually quite possibly what has happened. You should not die unknowingly. You need to see it coming, and you need to embrace that process. You don't need to get trapped between worlds. Other cases, though, are far more positive, where the deceased have intervened to help. In one case, it was to help a woman overcome her grief at the loss of her husband. And she had been trying to resurrect and continue the rituals of their happy life together. But in doing so, she trapped herself in a cycle of grief. And so in the healing process, he actually came through and said, please stop. So yeah, very, very touching things. Let me go on to another case. This is far more wild. This is an anthropologist. His name is Bruce Grindle. I guess he's Australian. Bruce had been working in, again, West Africa, in Ghana, I think. And the king's drummer, the royal drummer, had died unexpectedly. Okay, that was the situation. And therefore they had decided on a major ritual to try and understand what was behind the death. You know, was it externally caused, or was it natural, and so on. So the anthropologist was not invited to this ritual. Okay, so of course he slipped in uninvited. And then the following process unfolded. He describes how, as the ritual progressed, he experienced stronger and stronger psychophysical effects in his own body, including intense feelings of terror and dread. Now, while he's in this ritual, there's a group of ritual dancers dancing in the proximity of the corpse, which is laid out. The royal drummer is laid out there. And these ritualists, like a kind of shamanic ritual, are dancing in connection with it. And as they're doing so, there's an intensely energized field being generated. And that's what Bruce Grindle is experiencing in his own body. He shouldn't have been there. Let's say this right away. He was excluded for a reason. I mean, had it been safe for him to be in this thing, I'm sure they would have said, yeah, come and join in, so to speak. But no, this was a kind of necromantic rite. They were going to ascertain from the corpse what had happened. And that meant re-energizing the corpse. Okay, so he's having these enormously strong psychoenergetic effects in his own body, intense feelings of terror and dread, powerful stomach contractions, and then suddenly his awareness was like popping open, you know, greatly expanded, heightened sense of awareness. So he's like, his energy body is expanding and collapsing under the force of this ritual process going on in front of him. And then he said, suddenly experienced this huge jolt at the base of his skull, as though his head had been severed from the spine. And at that moment, a terrible and beautiful sight burst upon me. And these are his words: stretching from the amazingly delicate fingers and mouths of the ritual performers, strands of fibrous light played upon the head, fingers, and toes of the dead man. So he was seeing the streams of energy between the ritualists and the corpse at this point. The corpse, shaken by spasms, rose to its feet, spinning and dancing in a frenzy. Now, let me just add that Bruce Grindle got very ill after this. He was, I mean, the guys who were with him were saying, look, you're in danger of dying yourself. The energies you've been subjected to have like blown through your astral body. It's in disarray. And to be in disarray at the most fundamental level of your being, the energetic, is to risk death, quite frankly. So they then had to enact another healing ritual, like to put Humpty Dumpty back together. Oh, it's all good, clean fun, Vanish.
That is a crazy story. That must have been something that, beyond the energetic implications, but shocked him to the core to see a dead body get up and dance.
Again, this is all happening. Had you been outside the ritual space, you probably wouldn't see that. The problem is he'd entered the ritual space, and it's a different kind of space. It has different properties and qualities than normal space. So things are enacted within it which are impossible otherwise, but they happen nevertheless, and they're experienced by everybody who is, so to speak, enmeshed in that space. And they have real physical consequences once the ritual is over. And it's this paradoxical nature of ritually generated spaces, which is so difficult for people to grasp. Because looking at it at its face value, there's no way this could have happened. And it's even true to say it didn't happen. But it only didn't happen outside the ritual space. Problem for Bruce Grindle is it got himself inside the ritual space. He was too proximate to it and too engaged with it emotionally. And he, in fact, entered the ritual. And once he was in there, he was subject to all of the action that was going on another dimension, and which he subsequently carried with him after the ritual was over and damn near killed him. So it's interesting that, you know, to deal with magic at this level is to understand that ritual spaces are other places, physically, mentally, emotionally. And just as the family constellation, you actually are dealing with the deceased in some cases, and with crimes or you know, ethical violations in the long past. They're nevertheless real within the constellation. The people actually do feel and think as the people they're representing. And it has real consequences. That's why it's so important that psychologists resolve it there. So everyone comes out of the space clean, so to speak. But once you
I
move
think one of the, sorry, darling, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say that one of the things that has been so incredibly diluted in our kind of current society, the closest we get to a ritual is something that happens in a church, and it doesn't resemble at all what you're talking about. I mean, it's a completely different thing. Yeah,
it's theatrical ritual, essentially. You know, that's why I made that distinction. You know, efficacious ritual is really of another order, and it's notable that there are some ethnographic accounts which deal with this type of space, but it still remains marginal. For instance, Bruce Grindle's account in the anthropological journals has been there for years. It's well known. But you will not find anyone talking about it. It's part of the scientific record of it's just, you know, like the British, the Royal Society of Psychiatrists has work groups dealing with spirit removal. Okay, which is, you know, most people wouldn't anticipate the Royal Society of Psychiatrists, but they've had to develop that awareness because the consequences of not acknowledging it are too great. So yeah, there's contexts where it's kind of on the borders of professional bodies like anthropology, like psychiatry, but not quite intruding into the mainstream. And never talked about in public. It doesn't form part of their training. It doesn't form, you know. And what I'd ask, I mean, I did ask an anthropologist, I said, how many anthropologists do you think have experienced these kind of ritual effects and then refused to document them? And he says, probably a large proportion of them, because it would be career suicide. You know, Western academia is not favorable.
Not friendly to psi or any of these areas that are that you can't measure with a ruler. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it challenges too many fundamental assumptions. You know, we're still in the age of Enlightenment rationality. And still, to a large extent, you know, Adorno talked about the flip side of the coin of the Enlightenment, of course, is feeling superior to other races. It was the era of colonialism at its height of empire. So that stays there, you know, this sense of having this, you know, so for instance, the Renaissance culture, which is seen as foundational to Europe's high culture, is always framed as a supremely rational, evolving towards a higher level of rationality, which became, the great scientific revolutions of the 18th century, and then technological and so on and so forth. But in fact, of course, until the 18th century, all of the scientists, so-called scientists, including people like Newton, were totally sure that they were simply documenting the rules as God had set them out. God was the geometer, just as Plato had described him in the Timaeus. So that by doing science, you're essentially tracing the evolution of the deities' thought. Certainly Newton thought that. I didn't think he was doing some abstract description of the universe. So yeah, anyway, that's a much larger cultural question. But I just underline the fact that these accounts I've just read are by major figures in anthropology, and their accounts, their ethnographic records, are part of the scientific record. Okay, so
even though they sound like ghost stories, they're not. They're science.
Yeah, they're science, and that's the problem, really. Until we start accepting them as science, we can't move forward, because the implications of these fields for our larger conservatorship of communities and communities of animals, like, in the forests that we're cutting down, the communities we're disrupting. I mean, there's massive ethical implications for our inability or unwillingness to accept the unity of all sentient beings. And so we're kind of incurring the bad effects of that insensitivity, that institutionalized sensitivity. So,
and sentient beings in terms of animals, and in terms of these, like you're saying, the ancestors, these consciousnesses that are no longer embodied, that we can learn from, interact with, and all of that is just out the window.
Yeah. I mean, until we move away from shareholder value to stakeholder, and begin to incorporate stakeholder value in this broader sense, we are on a hiding to nothing. Anyway, just throw that in. Okay, so let me just, all I can do is summarize.
Yes, absolutely. My mind's blown. I'm still thinking about the dead body dancing around. But actually, I want to just jump in and say one thing that I kind of, to frame this whole discussion. When we started doing our interviews for Magical Egypt Magic episode, one of the things that you broke down for me was the different kinds of magic, and something that people might not be aware of and might not realize, because I didn't at that time. And healing, these healing practices have traditionally been a form of magic throughout human history. And that's why when you're talking about this, we are, in fact, even though we're talking about healing, we are talking about what has been one of the broadest sections of magic in history. So I just want to pop that in, because you told me that. But
yeah, I mean, if you look at the typical functions of shaman, who's the kind of prototypical mage or magician, 90% of what they do is healing or communal healing related. A small amount is to do with divination. And then a tiny amount is to do with what you may call pure sorcery of various kinds, attack sorcery, for instance. But it's all in the context of protecting a community. So yes, I mean, I still see energy healing as the fundamental discipline. Absolutely.
And even when we were talking about Luxor, for example, and I was asking you, what are the magical consequences of a temple like Luxor? And you were explaining that that was for the stability of the community or the civilization. So energetically, magically, am I right? Am I wrong? I'm remembering it correctly?
I mean, the point, I guess the the corollary of what I've just been saying is that the Egyptians from, I don't know, Bronze Age, what, 3000 BC, right through to the end of the pharaonic period, which is the Ptolemies in the 4th century. We're looking at absolutely vast continuities of ritual activity. If you consider that, for instance, the cult of Amun, during the great intermediate periods when Egypt was invaded, the cult of Amun ran the state. I mean, not just for a few years, for like 200 years. So that the daily rituals of Amun are kind of the guiding communal egregore of the entire country, from the borders of Africa up to the Nile Delta. It's impossible, given the reputation for ritual efficacy associated with this tradition of Egypt, that it would not have generated working egregores. And the question merely is whether you can access them today and to what end. Okay. I don't know if that's an answer for you, Benny.
No, that's a great answer, darling. Yes. I also just want to go to this Africa piece. I was looking at dream work, for example, and I think even Gordon might have it in his book, but the fact that I believe that there's a tribe in Africa that they dream communally. So when you're talking about the aspect of the community or the group as an egregore, this particular tribe takes it to the extent where they kind of all get up in the morning and, what was your dream about? And I had this piece, and you know what I mean? And it's a communal process rather than the way we feel about dreaming.
I mean, I was fascinated by the healing rituals, for instance, of the Bushmen in Southwest Africa. Again, this sense of living in a shared communal space in addition to the space of the village. Okay. Then there's the communal ritual space of the healing ritual they do, which is entirely engaged in, you know, they have this process whereby they have this stamping ritual. They go round and round. And as they do so, a number of people drop out because the energy becomes too much. But there's a number of people in the community who are capable of fully generating what's called the Kundalini energy during the course of the night. So they just like kick off this ritual at, you know, sunset, and by late in the night, a number of the individuals have got full Kundalini energy, and at that point they start healing. They start, you know, looking to the distance, you know, where are herds of animals, you know, all the communal activity is taking place in this strange communal space. I mean, it's like a parallel to the village communal space, and entirely acknowledged as such, because genuine healing happens over there. And then the village gets back to its normal day-to-day life, you know, squabbling and sharing resources and all that stuff, you know.
Looking after babies, all that,
Yeah. So it's like operating on two levels simultaneously, but they're not estranged from each other. You know, there's a continuity between the two, and there's a distinct pathway, a ritually defined pathway to make the transition from one to the other. You know, and some people are better at it than others. That's, you know, and therefore some people are much better healers than others. So it's not a democratic thing, so to speak. It's just, can you do it? Do you have the talent? That's all. Yeah. So I believe that this is very much, I mean, the high Egyptian culture that most of us are aware of is quite a late phenomena. I mean, the period at which that culture emerged from the Sahara, for instance, as the Sahara dried up, and influenced as well by the tribal culture of Africa to the south meant that early Egyptian culture had more in common with those societies and cultures, which we can still see remnants of today, than with the high culture of later pharaonic Egypt, of the pyramids. So essentially you have people who have the same communal basis to their existence and the same communal access to ritual space, moving into a phase of higher culture in terms of their architecture. Okay. So the notion that Egypt was not able to enact efficacious rituals is really a wrong pathway. And when we begin to think about efficacious ritual and the generation of the egregore around the symbolic world, I think most of us can feel that it still has a resonance. Many of us who are attracted to that architecture, to that space, and to its artworks can feel that it has this resonance, but the resonance is not, so to speak, the geometry or the fabric of it. It's what that geometry represents. Okay.
You know, you said earlier before the proof is in the pudding. Well, I think if you just look at the accomplishments and, you know, look at the geometry, look at the gnosis of the existence of that geometry and then their applications of it. How did they understand all of their cosmological alignments and all of that thing if they didn't get into this other space, this other realm, right? So the proof is in the pudding right there. That explains how they did these things.
It's one layer of explanation. I think most people have huge problem with accepting the existence of the deities as guiding influences in this. But I've tried to illustrate that these ritual spaces connect to other dimensions. And so to speak, the inhabitants of those dimensions remain ineffable. But when they're filtered through the lens of a particular culture, whether it's Egyptian or Tibetan or Indian or whatever, then those deities take on distinctive forms and are associated with distinctive qualities. Okay. And those qualities are manifested. So, for instance, in the Vajrayana tradition, you reverse the flow. Essentially, you enter the ritual space of the mandala, which is a plan of a three-dimensional palace, okay? And in the course of the initiation, you visualize, and through the visualization, which is essentially the ritual process of becoming efficacious, you connect with the deity or deities. The influx of the deities' energy is the initiation, okay? It's not by virtue of limited human beings that initiation takes place. And it's not a theatrical ritual. It's an actual influx of divine energy. And divine is not the abstract. It's mediated through what are called higher order beings. So the ability to, so to speak, run efficacious rituals of this order with this evolutionary motivation behind them is sufficient to reconnect with these higher order beings. Okay. So that's how the mechanism is certainly envisaged in Vajrayana, and I can't imagine it's changed much. I mean, my study of the ritual initiation process of Dionysus in the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii indicated a very similar process. That although the deity and consort had a very specific iconography associated with them, which is typically Hellenistic, nevertheless, the initiatory moment they are merely an egregoric doorway to a higher order of energy that inflows. So that the people who had the initiation, whether it's the mysteries of Eleusis, mysteries of Dionysus or Mithras, essentially evolve spiritually in the sense that they become cognizant of a higher order of reality as part of their day-to-day living. Whereas before they were just kind of stumbling along, limited by their own personas and the people around them. All of a sudden, that door is like flung open. And this is the evolutionary value of initiation, to my mind.
Peter, that's absolutely amazing. I mean, you've blown my mind again. I don't know how you continue to do it, but you've absolutely blown my mind again. And look, that aspect, when we were talking for Magical Egypt season 4, the idea of the deity and the influx of the energies is something that was a paradigm shift for me in my understanding of the mysteries. I think it was very important. But also when you're talking about the alignment of these different ritualistic traditions and the processes that they went through and the similarities amongst them. I mean, we are dealing with a body and a human body and a human mind, and to raise the energy, there's only so many things that you can do, right? To raise our energy to a point that we can access that. So it makes sense that there would be an alignment in these different practices. I'm going to get that little book you were talking about, because I'm very, very curious.
The Dances to the Gods.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a
Oh,
very interesting text.
amazing. Well, darling, I just want to thank you. I think this has been revelatory. And unless there's any, I think you've summarized. Is there anything else you want to add?
That's it.
That's it. Well, I want to say that's enough. And I always enjoyed talking to you, Peter. I know my audience is going to be blown away. So thank you so much, my love, for your time.
Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure, Venice.
Oh, darling, I'm gonna have to sit and really think about this, because it's a huge idea. And like you said, it's so alien to us, let alone the ritual part of it has been so diluted that we've been so disconnected for it. But the ability to access these realms where you have these energy fluxes and higher gnosis, that is so rare for most people today.
Yeah, it is. Although it is accessible through traditions like Vajrayana, those traditions are quite alien to most of us. So our own traditions have ceased to provide that experience, and that's the great loss that we've undergone.
I don't think a little bread cracker and a sip of red cordial is going to cut it, huh? Like that's the only ritual that I grew up with, right? That was it. So yeah, we have a long way to come, darling. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.